So today's video is inspired by a comment that someone left on one of my videos the other day, asking if I could share my thoughts on doing a philosophy degree as an undergraduate. And I did think about answering this question, and maybe I will if I do a more general Q&A video at some point. But instead I wanted to focus on my experiences as an English literature undergrad, because part of my degree initially in the first year I was joint honours English and philosophy, and I dropped English after the first year, which you might think is strange given that this channel is all about literature, and a lot of the books that I have reviewed are definitely in the English literary canon, and I would say that a lot of my books favourite books fit in that category as well. So I wanted to talk about that in this video. Just what do I think of it as a degree? Do I think it's worth it? And why did I drop out, given that I seem to enjoy reading as much as I do given the channel? So part of my reason for taking English literature and philosophy was that those were the A-levels that I did, and I always had a bit of a philosophical mind growing up. I was always interested in philosophical questions, more sort of standard basic ones that people are interested in, like life after death questions, maybe more spiritual questions than the standard philosophical ones that you start doing at university. But those were the things that really interested me. Things about the existence of God. I went through several religions when I was growing up, and still to this day I'm sort of hesitating between religions all the time because my mind is never made up on these things. But I also enjoyed, of course, reading, although never as prolifically as I did when it comes to thinking or even writing. I've always written books and done that a lot more than I have read, but I've always enjoyed reading, and I was very good at English at school. I enjoyed writing stories, so it sort of just took off from there. And what I liked about English literature in school was that we didn't really touch theory all that much. It was very much, you would read a book, you would be able to interpret the text, and you would obviously have to evidence your interpretation with quotations, with pointing out relevant passages and how the whole story hangs together. And I really liked that way of criticising novels, and I would actually say it's that style of criticism that I tend to employ in my videos. I do a little bit of research when I do a more analysis style review, just to see what things people have said, because I might agree with those things or I might disagree with them. So for example, when I did my Dracula videos, I knew actually from school some of the feminist interpretations of that, and so I used those kinds of things sometimes as a foil for my own arguments. But generally I try to stay away from the theory and focus on the book itself. Now this changed when I went to university, and I think this was one of the reasons why I eventually dropped out of English. Another reason being, I'm going to be honest, my grades in the English literature side were significantly worse than my philosophy grades. I was always a solid 2-1, edging to a first with philosophy, and I improved over time. The English only got worse throughout the year. I think I got my only third in English. Maybe it was a 2-2, I don't remember. In any case, as you can see, my English grades were not great at university. But I also just wasn't very enthusiastic about the subject either. And part of this might be to do with the text as well. I can't really say that any of the text that we looked at stood out to me. I remember we did Virginia Woolf. I didn't enjoy Virginia Woolf back then. Mrs. Dalloway, did not get on with that book. I thought it was just too strange. We did The Turning of the Screw by Henry James. I found that to be a bit of a bore, to be honest. I don't know if that would be my view now, but at the time I really did. There was a book, I can't remember what the book was called. We did some poetry, but it was very scattered, and the way that they taught poetry was just very difficult for me to get my head around. There was way too much focus on like rhyme schemes and structure, and that sort of stuff goes out of my head. I'd rather focus on the the words, really. So that I always struggled with that. And so nothing really hung together. But one thing that I think bothered me most of all was that it was very theory-driven, the way in which interpretation was done at university. It was very much like the academics had a literary theory in mind, and typically it was a school of criticism. So, typically feminist criticism or more Marxist criticism, and that kind of literary criticism has never appealed to me, because I think it can be interesting, right? Because if you have a theory like, say, feminism, you then have certain ideas about how women ought to be presented in a novel, what it means for a woman to be presented well or badly, same for men. And so then you can view the novel and interpret through that lens. But for me, that's always felt slightly, potentially inappropriate, right? So, it might be interesting to analyze the Bible from a Muslim point of view, but if I want to understand the Bible, I should probably take a Christian perspective, since that's, what the text is, that's the tradition that it's in. So it's not that I think that applying theory is bad or completely, we shouldn't do it. I just found it was too much, and I found that it actually got in the way of my ability to appreciate some of the texts. Because when you have a school of criticism that says these are the ways in which things should be presented, often it's treated as some kind of code for writing good novels. And this is something that I disagree with. I don't think that the craft of novel writing should be beholden to any school of literary criticism. It might be that from a feminist or Marxist perspective or a capitalist perspective, whatever, that certain things are good or bad according to this perspective. But that to me is not really about the novel and the art of writing novels. That is about the school of thought and its ideas about what is right or wrong, good or bad, that is then just being applied. I use the example of Dracula because this was one, like I say, actually one that came out in school rather than university, one aspect where the theory did come into school. And it's this interpretation of Lucy and Mina especially as ultimately just sort of weak, pathetic women because they don't live up to the ideal of what a modern feminist would like them to live up to. And I find that quite damaging to the female characters in literary history, because it's actually meant that a lot of female characters who are very interesting, are very, worth exploring and seeing what they're all about, they often just get sidelined as, oh no, that's just another, she's just another innocent virgin type victim, or she's just another femme fatale figure. And it's like, well, yes, she may be a femme fatale and she may be a victim, but maybe she's an interesting one. So for example, with Lucy, there is a point in Dracula where, the reason why she dies eventually in the story is because she's kept in the dark, because the men around her patronize her and think that she couldn't handle the truth. And there's a very specific scene where Van Helsing is really patronizing to her and tells her, you need to just, be a good girl and you're very sweet and lovely. And, he's not being mean to her, but he's being, he's being very gentlemanly in an old-fashioned way. But it comes across as condescending. He keeps her in the dark. She dies. They also keep Lucy's mother in the dark. She dies. When Mina is eventually excluded from the men, she almost dies, and then she gets let back in and she's able to thrive. So there's clearly something more subtle going on in the representation of women in Dracula, even if Stoker is also a little bit scared of sexuality, which I think is maybe to do more with his sexuality than anything to do with women, which is another reason why I don't like criticism, is that it can often skew an interpretation so much that other options get left out. So people are more likely to focus on the fact that, Stoker is scared of female sexuality. But maybe it's to do with his actual sexuality. We have some indication that he may have been a repressed homosexual man, so it's possible that maybe there's something interesting there we could explore, but that gets left out of the conversation when you're so focused on applying, say, feminist criticism in this case. So for me, that's what really led to my eventual breaking up with English literature at university. Partly because of the bad grades, I'm not going to lie, but also I think the reason why I was getting bad grades is because I wasn't doing that kind of criticism. I wasn't using the theories. So we would read these texts about theory, and I would sometimes find them interesting. As I said, I'm not anti-theory entirely, but I wouldn't necessarily want to apply them to the text itself. I remember one essay I did, a poetry essay, and you essentially chose a poet from this big anthology of books. And I was completely lost at this point. This was really towards me thinking, right, I'm dropping out of this. So I'm just going to do whatever. I found this poet. I want to say she was called Phyllis Wheatley. I could be wrong, but I think that's her name. And she was a black slave, but she was essentially, if I'm remembering rightly, I think she was either she was still a slave or she was freed by her family. In any case, they treated her like an actual child. They educated her really well. And she wrote some poems about slavery that were sort of bizarre because, on the one hand, she felt very grateful to her, her white slave-owning family for what they did, but then also, black people are still enslaved. So she wrote some really interesting poems, I thought. Anyway, I interpreted them just based on what I read in the poems. So not trying to impose any sort of colonialistic or post-colonial or whatever the relevant theory would be there. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in what are her words saying, what do they mean according to my interpretation, and going that way. I thought it was great. At the very least, it was the one English essay that I really enjoyed, and it did not get the best mark. It didn't get a third, but maybe it got a very low 2.1 maybe, or maybe just a 2.2, I don't remember. But in any case, it really wasn't for me, and so that was when I decided, you know what, I'm going to stick with what I seem to be doing better at. And I have actually come a little bit round full circle, because I never did aesthetics while I was at university. sort of stayed away from philosophy of art stuff, and I think probably because I thought, well, are we just going to go back to what I didn't like about English literature? No, it was quite different to do philosophy of art. It's not the same as literary criticism. So now I've started to do that again. I've got a paper coming out in aesthetics for the first time, which I'm looking forward to being released. So I have sort of warmed to that sort of more artistic academic side again, but not in the literary criticism school. So would I recommend doing English literature at university? Well, I can't say I could because I didn't think, it just didn't suit me. If you are someone who doesn't like theory, then I certainly wouldn't recommend it. Now it was, I think, about 10 years ago now when I started my undergrad. So maybe this isn't true anymore. Maybe universities have become a bit less theory driven. So it's certainly worth looking out for if you want to do a degree in English literature, seeing how much theory is there. But if you are someone that doesn't like the theory stuff, then I wouldn't recommend doing the degree. There are also other things that I could bemoan about the modern state of academia and the things that end up on syllabuses and the things that don't end up on syllabuses. Nevertheless, I will leave that for another video. That's just my experience as someone who did English literature for a year. But obviously, I eventually found my way back to reading. I have always written, as I said at the beginning of the video. You do have to read if you're going to be a good writer. I mean, there are some people who think you shouldn't read if you want to be a writer because you'll just end up copying people, which is a very bizarre view to have because, like, think of any craft. You learn the craft by watching people do it, doing it yourself, and yes, sometimes imitating them for a while, and then once you sort of learn the rules, you can then start breaking the rules and sort of branching out. So it's a very bizarre view to have, is that you shouldn't you shouldn't read if you're going to write. And so that was part of the motivation as well for the channel, was not just because I wanted to talk about books, it was to encourage me to read, because it was a reason, or is still a reason, to read. If I know that I haven't made a video in a while, it's like, well, maybe you should make some time again and do a bit more reading. So that's why I started the channel, and as I said, it's really made me enjoy analysing books again, which after the university experience wasn't something that I thought I was good at, or certainly not interested in. And as I say, I think the reason for that is just, for me, there was too much theory at university, and I wasn't that interested in the theories, and I do still quite strongly believe that the best way to approach criticism is to begin with the text itself. Obviously, you're going to have certain ideas, and you have your morality and things, and you are going to view the novel through that lens, right? So it's not like you can ever fully get away from it, but there is a big difference between sort of organically just engaging with the text and seeing how you react to it, and maybe you are a feminist or a Marxist, and so those kinds of things that the theorist would focus on, you'll also focus on them given your beliefs. But that's a very different thing from rigidly imposing a theory and saying that a novel is good or bad based on whether or not it conforms to a theory. And the reason why I think it's much better to do it this more organic way is because you're putting the novel first, and if you can keep your mind open and free while you read, then there's all kinds of possibilities that you can explore that are freezed out if you impose a theory. So that's why I would always prefer this other method, even if you can never get away from a perspective, because of course you can't. Everything is from a perspective, but it's a question of how rigidly you force that perspective. And I think that there is more and less open ways to do that. Anyway, that's everything that I wanted to say about this. Let me know down in the comments if you studied English literature at university, or literature in general, if you're studying it now or in the past. What did you think of it? Did you enjoy it? Did it make you enjoy reading more, or did it actually make you hate reading a little bit like it did for me at the time? And if so, why? Look forward to hearing your experiences down in the comments. As I said, I'm not firmly recommending or not recommending doing a literature degree, but I would say, from my experience, if the theory is something you're not that interested in, maybe don't approach things academically and just enjoy the pleasure of reading, because you really don't need theory in order to enjoy a book.